Thanks very much, Mike, and thank you for being here on Saturday morning for such a dense lecture. I was very excited to receive this invitation and for this particular topic, which brings us back to very fundamental questions about what we do as art practitioners and how we reflect on it. I have to stress that the work I'm going to present here is especially the sort of artistic work is the product of collaboration with many people and institutions. So I need first and foremost to mention Frédéric Bevilacqua and the team Interaction sans musique mouvement at IRCAM. It's the team that deals with music as interaction, and particularly with gesture and gesture capture, motion capture. Then lately, so I've been working with them since 2014, basically. Jean-François Gégaud and Aurélien Duval are two visual artists in sort of virtual reality or interactive staging of any sort of data, basically. Aurélien works a lot with Unity for creating virtual reality. Jean-François is an expert on motion capture again. And we have an ongoing project since 2020, basically, at Université Paris 8 in Paris, and in collaboration always with EUR Artec, which is a school in Paris for human mediations, digitalization, and things like that. Also lately we work with Stella Paschalidou, and she's a Greek researcher at the Department of Music Technology and Acoustics, Hellenic Mediterranean University in Greece. So those are my current collaborators. I have to mention also Maki Solomos, who is a Xenakis expert and has been curating this project since 2020. I'm going to be presenting, and myself at the moment I'm a Humboldt Stiftung Fellow at TU Berlin. I'm also a collaborator of the team of Frédéric Bevilacqua at IRCAM, and I will be teaching from 23 as an associate professor in music communication technology at the University of Ioannina. The background of this work emerges first and foremost from my own experience as a performer of contemporary music. Then, as a musicologist, I have focused a lot on the issues that arise through the performative turn and the embodied cognitive turn in musicology, but I've looked also in the sort of roots of embodied cognition in psychology, and the third big field is human-computer interaction, interactive systems, movement modeling as they are being conducted at IRCAM. So the concept of this very speculative talk, at least as far as the first part is concerned, is to claim that there is a constant oscillation between epistemology, that is our access to knowledge through performance, and ontology, which is, the way I see it here, performance itself in research. So we can never claim, so to speak, either a pure form of ontology, Ding an sich, as Kant would put it, or a sort of pure mediation to knowledge which leaves us without a clue about the thing itself, when the thing is performance. And that brings me to four basic pillars, which is embodied experience, multimodal data, which sort of emerge out of this embodied experience, the issue of representation, whether we are talking about mental representation or about external representations, and eventually, first and foremost, the issue of interaction between all these elements. And so I'll make a first part which will focus on epistemology in a more general way. Then I'll present my hypothesis of embodied navigation of complex notation. I have developed this hypothesis since many years, and the basic claim is that we don't understand notation and then play, but we basically shape notation at all times through our actions. And eventually I will show a few tools and applications through the multimodal data I use for this research. So, first part. This lecture comes at a very opportune time somehow, because last week we had the passing of Bruno Latour, a major French intellectual figure and a major contributor to modern epistemology, or postmodern, post-structural, also a very controversial figure in many ways. Many people have accused him for forging and cultivating post-truth sort of dictums, but I think his contribution is major in revealing multiple entry points to truth, rather than advocating for many different truths. So, a quote from a book dedicated to Bruno Latour by Gérard de Vries: "The modern philosophical tradition holds observation in high regard. Nevertheless, it is obsessed by a worldview that feeds off dualities between humans and non-humans, nature and society, facts and values, science and politics. Bruno Latour wants us to observe better, find a finer resolution, to become more attentive, to redescribe the world we live in, and to better understand our current predicament. He introduced ethnography and comparative anthropology as vital methods for philosophy. Latour is an empirical philosopher. That is, a philosopher basically of our time." So I like very much this sort of positioning, because it takes us back to the basics, and it renders all that is going to follow from now on speculative. And I think it is with this sort of modest spirit that we should be approaching any epistemological question. The second reference is Hans-Jörg Reinberger from his Epistemology of the Concrete. And here is Tim Lenoir writing in the preface, of this work. Reinberger's work is an exercise in historical epistemology, a distinctive Franco-German approach to the history and philosophy of science. In contrast to earlier traditions in the philosophy of science that treated truth as independent of the context of discovery and the history of scientific knowledge as a linear, progressive march in the elimination of error, asymptotically approaching nature, this particular branch of historical epistemology treats knowledge as historically contingent and focuses on uncovering the conditions of possibility and fundamental concepts that organize the knowledge of different historical periods. Reinberger regards the aim of historical epistemology as to understand the conditions of possibility underlying the knowledge and practice of specific conjunctions of scientific and technical practice, the social, institutional, and cultural configurations in which they operate. Historical specificity is essential to this philosophical project. In other words, epistemology is always situated, is always both in history and in a certain social political reality. So what and how do we get to know about performance in the global north? It's very important to stress that we are privileged to be able to pursue this form of knowledge through specific means. That doesn't mean that other forms of knowledge don't exist, even with much simpler or much more deprived means. And today we're talking about this moment, and what we say can change. So I'm rather talking about some founding myths, and that's why in my title, I'm using these three basic, so to speak, modes of gaining access to knowledge. Getting wet. So here I'm talking about embodied experience as the foundation of performance. I'm pretty sure that today everybody dealing with artistic research in the performative arts would agree that we cannot ignore the experience of the practitioner, whether composer or performer or the listener, very, very importantly, if we talk about music. But this was not always the case. This is the product of certain terms, which I already mentioned in musicology, and the emergence of artistic research or performance-based research, as they call it in the Anglo-Saxon word, or recherche création, as we call it in France. So this is a new thing, and actually there could be, before these turns, someone could argue that no, actually there are ways to study performance without this sort of almost bias of subjective experience.
Is it appropriate to ask a question or not?
Absolutely. I mean, we are in an informal setting, so.
How early do you go in the experience of embodied experience? Because I'm thinking about the experiments that took place at UCSD with Pauline Oliveros, Kenneth Gaburo, with their sensing, meditative research that they were doing in terms of performance and composition.
That's sort of a, one could get there, but that's a sort of a very primordial questions and founding myths. So I don't want to situate it so specifically, but obviously, yeah, if we're talking about the modern sort of psychology, psychological study of performance, then of course those are valuable points of reference. But here I want to just present three different ways or modes of access to knowledge, right? So the first is embodied experience in itself, so to speak, and its value for that. The second is what I have mentioned in my title as reciting definitions for the water. This actually comes from one of my favorite authors, modern Greek authors, who is Yorgos Himonas, and in his novel, The Builders, he evokes an image of an almost pre-Socratic, and I will explain what I mean by that, pre-Socratic experience. So he's describing this crowd that approaches the water. In his novels, we don't have individual heroes, we have crowds as heroes, and that's very, very interesting positioning. And so he's describing this sort of population, and he says more courageous ones approached the edge of the water, filling it devoutly with their palms. They studied with those ancient eyes of madmen, reciting definitions for the water. So we have this sort of, here it's not really the sort of embodied experience, which means being immersed in the water of performance and being surrounded by it, but it's just this sort of very careful approaching and trying to reach the essence through introspection, through, as I say in the previous slides, through maybe even what we today call metacognition, so being able to study consciousness and awareness, and this is a very hot topic obviously in cognitive science today and in performance research. How do performers think about what they do? But you see, this is some modality of processing experience, and this brings us to a completely different position. So it's one thing to do it, it's a different thing to think about it, and think when, after, during, no. And pre-Socratic ontology means it's a reference to pre-Socratic philosophers, like for example in the case of water, it was Thales, the Milesius. They were the philosophers that were trying to sort of detect one basic essence for the universe, and they were actually claiming that they can have access, epistemic access to this one essence. And of course, this sort of description of the experience, of definition of the water, brings us to the issue of first, second, and third person descriptions, which is major for artistic research, as Mark Lemon one of many people who do it defines them in his embodied music cognition. So first person descriptions, meaning the subjective or auto-ethnographic sort of approach. Second person descriptions, describing the intersubjective or ethnographic. And third person descriptions, describing the objective scientific method based on empirical data, whether qualitative or quantitative. And the third founding myth is the, so to speak, after the pre-Socratics, the looking at shadows on cave walls, right? It's a reference to the famous Plato's cave myth, whereby it's claimed that humans don't have access to the reality, to the higher reality, which is the reality of Platonic ideas, but they are closed in a cave and they can only look at the shadows that are produced by fires of those very higher truths. So all our perception, basically, and our phenomenological approaches are mediations, representations, and this opens per se the question of epistemology, obviously, of access. It's not accidental that today we have so many theories about simulation in both in physics or in consciousness, that claim that reality is indeed not real. And of course, it's in artistic practice, it has very palpable manifestations with things like virtual reality, augmented reality. If we continue with some more modern founding myths, in data science, we find this pyramid, whereby people are aware that the use of empirical data is actually not necessarily leading to knowledge, to this sort of there are very discrete steps which take us from data to information, and then to knowledge, and then to what they call wisdom, meaning the sort of adapting and the right strategies for dealing with situations. But again, there is a question for me, or many more questions in this sort of founding myth, which gives this sort of prominence in data themselves. Why should it be data? Isn't there room for the formulation of some sort of insights which are much more holistic and encompassing before we go back to data? So I think those are very legitimate questions. And here is Reinberger again, who writes, not by chance an epistemology and history of experimentation crystallized conjointly. The question now was no longer how knowing subjects might attain an undisguised view of their objects, but rather the question was what conditions had to be created for objects to be made into objects of empirical knowledge under historically variable conditions. And that means that this experimentation part is important for being able to address those questions in a speculative way. So my own modest proposal here is that we treat performance as an ontology, dealing with performance in itself and for itself, which can lead us to some very, very objective data, and that's the main form of epistemology I would advocate for. But then performing with the data, that is using the data for further artistic or scientific applications, is a new form of ontology. And there is this some sort of feedback loop which takes us always, and that's why I'm talking about an oscillation, right? Okay. Second part, I'll talk a bit about a very specific. Yeah, absolutely.
This thing. So with the data, we have epistemology, and then is it not a subset of epistemology, the classification of how we deal with this data? So you have an internal.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The classification, the different modes of dealing with data, as I'll show a few applications in the third part. But yeah, that makes part of epistemology. Right. But when one uses the data, for example, as I will be using data of motion capture in order to create a new performance whereby I'm controlling visuals with my hands, that's a very, very different thing. It gives some insights to either the performer or the audience, but at the same time, it's a new form of ontology as well, because it creates something new, and that's what's meant here. But of course, the sort of epistemic content is there.
Right. And then we have also performer knowledge, audience knowledge.
Exactly. 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 Totally. Totally. There are many different actors, many different agents in this, and of course the type of knowledge being produced is totally different. Which are issues I'm going to touch upon right away. So going back to this second part, I have proposed initially years ago, and then also with cognitive psychologist Anthony Chemero, who is very well known for what he terms radical embodied cognition. We have proposed a model of dealing with notation which does away with the notion of mental representation, basically. So the question there was, how can we outsource mental representations to embodied interaction with symbols and technology, notated symbols meaning, in the most complex instances of piano music, which is my specialty as a pianist. And why complex? Because complexity problematizes representability, computability, and predictability. All three tenets which were also very important in Fernando's talk yesterday, I think. And we had this follow-up discussion which was really valuable for me. In a different domain, we would talk in the domain of human-computer interaction. We would describe this experience, or they describe it, for example, in the laboratory INRIA at the University Paris-Saclay, they describe it as extreme users in extreme situations. They have actually a lab called Ex Situ, exactly based on this concept. And it's important to say that these very complex instances present us with representation-hungry tasks, as they are called in philosophy jargon, not minimally cognitive behavior, which is the mainstream when studying this sort of representations. And of course, this sort of predilection for complex music doesn't reveal some sort of new complexity fetish, but the conclusions are to be extended in all musical interaction with or without notation. So the premise here is to deal with notation as a dynamic system, as mentioned yesterday. And there I have also those four basic references as for complexity, embodied interaction, representation, and interactive systems. Complex piano performance can be better explained as embodied interaction with symbolic notation, which is adapted for direct perception and action through interactive systems. That's the basic idea without mental representations. So instead of having a notation fixed, as it was the case in Fernando's piece yesterday, instead of having this rigid image, we imagine notation as an element which dynamically changes. And that can actually function as a proxy for mental representation. That's the theory. The main theoretical references are Radical Embodied Cognitive Science by Chemero, Dynamic Systems Theory by people like Randall Beer, Ecological Psychology, of course we all know. Computational theories of mind are the main targets of, I would say, rethinking this sort of approach. So like theories by Fodor, for example, to just mention a very big name, but also the predictive processing as advocated by Mark Lemon in his 2016 book is also here somehow in question. And eventually the basic theories of mental representation, the traditional view, which, as we'll see later, posits that everything that's either absent or present in our perception counts as a mental representation, as opposed to theories which posit an absence of the target of the representation in order to consider it as such. Complexity can be seen as quantitative and qualitative traditionally, but in our theory it's also dynamic, it changes over time, and it's also grounded in multimodal reality. So it's not only a symbolic event, but inside the graphisms there is already movement, touch, sight, all sorts of kinesthetic and real experiences.
Yeah, in fact, in my collaborations with people dealing with complex systems, they say that you don't. The word dynamic is already implied in the notion of complex systems, so you don't need actually to say the word dynamic
Even
because it's understood.
It's understood that they change over time. But in notation, it's far from clear, because we do have a very sort of fixed external representation. So it's good to, I think, to underline the implication of dynamicity that exists in the notation. It's not only a physical space, but it's also a temporal space.
You also mean that it's non-linear and dynamic?
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, you've seen instances of the complex notation I'm talking about and I'm having in mind. This is Lemma Icon Epigram by Brian Fernyhough, the first 2 pages. Or this is another example, completely different, by Iannis Xenakis from the work Mists. It's a stochastic section which has been composed on the basis of the laws that govern gas. So it's stochastic constellations of pitch. And it was music like that which sort of gave me the initiative to start dealing with notation as a dynamic element, so transforming notations, in the beginning with very conventional means like rewriting. So here, for example, I have retranscribed this cloud into 4 staves just to show the pitch constellations more clearly, and then I've shown the sort of embodied layers, the ways I'm processing that in an embodied way, so either through hand grasps or through movements. Our movements are indicated with these arrows here, either with isolated notes, fingerings, and this sort of thing creates very different structures, obviously, than the initial constellation by Xenakis. And then I have further, this gives this rotated view by 90 degrees, gives the view of the piano, basically. So right hand is on the right, the blue sort of circles are corresponding to the right hand, the orange ones to the left hand, and the in-between arrows, these pink arrows are used to show the interconnecting movements. So we're going from fingers to hands and then to arm movements. So we take a very fragmented surface, which is node to node, and we create gradually this sort of continuous movement, which manifests eventually like 2 linear trajectories like that. And there the sort of pink discontinuities are exactly the leaps of the performer, rapid leaps, so the points where it becomes really hard or impossible in conventional terms. So that's an example of how representation can be changing from the point of view of the performer, from an embodied point of view, and how this representation can further be used for creating new media, new interactions. And yeah, with reference to James J. Gibson's theory of ecological perception, we define these transformations of the notation as a state space of affordances, what I can do with notation in an embodied way. And then the breakthrough in my work since 2014 through the work with Frédéric Bevilacqua was exactly being able to take these conventional representations and correlate them with multimodal data. So revealing the grounded sort of content of the notation, not only the dynamic, but also the grounding, the grounded in terms of grounding in real physical energies. Now here I have a heavy theoretical part about representations, which maybe is better for you to read in the paper. I will give you the relevant reference. Basically, representations in this theory can be either, as I said, causally coupled to the target of the representation. So, for example, if I have a score on the piano and I play from the score is causally coupled to me. But if I go out, take a walk, and I remember a passage in the score, then this is decoupled, obviously. I can still remember, I have a memory of it, I have a mental representation of the score, but the score is not there, it's absent physically. So basically the whole philosophical debate, and it's a very heated debate about representation, is whether we count the presence of the score as a representation. And in the traditional view that most philosophers embrace, like a huge amount, that it is exactly this acceptance of the presence, of the physical presence of the target of the representation, which leads to the source of the sort of outsourcing of the representation. Because if we count this presence as representation, indeed, then we can replace the sort of interaction which happens mentally with actions that happen externally. That's the main gist of it. But there is lots of very, very elaborate discussions about that, and we are following with Anthony Chimero in our paper very, very close, detailed.
So you're on the side of being decoupled when you're not in the presence of the score?
No, we are on the side exactly. We are following the traditional view of representation, and that's how we claim that we can outsource what happens in the head to the environment. And this is the notation we have developed for it. So basically, if the target is causally coupled to the mental representation, then a score, which stands here as XR, as an external representation, through the optimization with the means I'm going to present, renders the mental representations of the performer not really necessary. The score can drive performance, but for that to happen, we need certain adaptive transformations of the score that take place both in real time and over time. Here there are a bit more things, but I want to jump to what finally is instantiated through such a model is what Mark Rowlands, the American philosopher, would call environmentalism. The environment conceived as consisting of information-bearing structures which organisms can potentially identify and appropriate. The manipulation of those structures itself is identified as indispensable for cognition, a form of information processing. In performing any given task, the more information the organism can process externally, the less information it has to process internally. Maximization of efficiency happens by minimizing the internal costs, and that has been shown to have evolutionary advantages. So when one is confronted, the idea here is that when one is confronted with something like that, then it's more advantageous not to memorize that and node by node, but to rather process it externally to start. And this is what, in my experience, most people do with very difficult music like that. They just start finding things around, in patching things together, so to speak, and processing in this very, very pragmatic way before they can claim that they can play it. So they don't create a mental proxy for that, a mental representation, but they rather sort of work their way through it. Of course, then you can create, one can claim that those are mental representations when I show the hand grasps and the arms. That's a very good question. Aren't they? They can be, but at the same time, in this instantiation, they are external. They are on paper again. So, and the claim is that by feeding the performer with things like that, you can drive the performer to play without necessarily engaging in this sort of way with the score.
So in Chinese martial arts, this is the way that traditionally people had learned.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than the internal representation leading or guiding their practice,
Mm-hmm.
it was through the external, through the doing,
Yeah.
that led for years and years to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, all sorts of somatic practices, I think, have this common experience of practitioners that are faced with some sort of impossible challenge or some sort of burden, and instead of dealing with that directly, they sort of bypass it in some way or other. If we want to think of another artistic practice, when I was young, I was very fond of Grotowski's theory on theater, for example, who was talking about the Polish director who was talking about the stumbling blocks of the actor and how the actor rather needs to remove blocks from their practice and not create a toolbox of skills. So not skill building, but removing blocks, stumbling blocks. That I find very, very interesting. Okay, and passing to the third part with some very, very real examples of how this theory is instantiated. I have to mention we have an homage to Iannis Xenakis, the Greek composer, Greek-French composer that was born 100 years ago. And so I thought it would be appropriate to continue this homage with some case studies, mostly from his own work. So I'll talk a bit about the very specific affordances and constraints of the systems that have been developed for this sort of learning experience and performing experience. And then I'll show very concrete applications in both computational musicology, so the more scientific, so to speak, part, epistemic part, but also technology-enhanced learning, so systems developed for essentially facilitating the learning process, as well as our project with augmented reality. In the end, I will have a small postlude about the sort of forms of epistemic violence, that is the biopolitics of this body rendition into data, which is a very hot topic today, generally speaking, not only in music. So the main motivation for dealing with Xenakis is, first of all, to challenge the challenge trope. We discussed yesterday also with Fernando that very often this complex music is seen as a medium for exhibiting, transhumanist aspirations, superintelligence aspirations, things like that. And part of my work is exactly to be able to find mediations and ways of dealing with those things in a much more, I would say, efficient way, but not only for efficiency's sake, also as a means of appreciating what is really the new threshold that these efficient means reveal, and what is the more important aspects of the music, of this music, the nuances and the subtleties that very often are lost in this quest for super virtuosity and in this, I would say, macho exhibition of a certain ability. The second problem with Xenakis is the mind-body problem, as we have called it with my colleagues. So with Xenakis you have two decouplings of that take place. The first decoupling is between what is written and what is expected to happen, and many people have written on impossibilities on how what is written cannot be humanly exactly be reproduced. The second decoupling is the decoupling between the notation and the multimodal data. So somehow we transpose, we turn the body into data, and we transpose the original decoupling between notation and performance to a decoupling between notation and data. And we study the decoupling, we study what is possible and what is not through the data. That's the basic idea. But talking about data and systems for capturing those data is not really so straightforward. There are specific affordances and specific constraints. Here is an example of a system we tried to use, which is called perception neuron. It's a system for full body motion capture. And here trying to capture the fingers, not only for Xenakis but even for Mozart or anything, was a pain. You can see this chunky sort of sensors standing on my fingers, and of course there was no way I could either cross hands without ripping them off, or no way they wouldn't be ripped off through the black keys of the instrument, right? So that's a very good example of why looking for the...
You couldn't play Stockhausen's clavier
yeah. No, you could play Stockhausen's clavier stick just to destroy the system, you know, and the piano, and the hands probably. So that's a typical constraint for a performer, and then of course...
Can we go back a second?
Yes, sure.
What are they? Can you? What exactly can you measure with those velocities?
So those are inertial sensors, and there are normally 9 axes, so 3 directions of linear acceleration, then rotation, 3 axes of rotation, and also this is calibrated, so there is magnetic poles, so you can orient yourself in space according to the magnetic field.
So it's a way more complex accelerometer, no? In a way? Do you realize?
Yes, it's not. It's accelerometer, gyroscope, and magnetometer, 3 in 1, so to speak. And the idea is you have. You will see later, because I'll show the whole motion capture, because we did use it eventually, but without the fingers.
Okay. So it measures velocity.
It measures acceleration. It measures acceleration.
So it's close. Does it measure
Or
force?
Euler angles for the rotation.
Okay. What about force on the key?
No, there is no force. There are other systems for measuring force, with piezoelectric, for example. But
Through what you measure force?
there are specific sensors that could be placed on the keys, whereby you measure.
On the keys. Okay.
Yes, of course. This is just an instance. This was just an instance to show you the sort of problems one might come up with when using those things.
So accelerometer, gyroscope, and the third one?
And magnetometer. the absolute positioning in space in relation to the poles. Yeah, basically. And you get those 9 values, basically, in time, as signals. Yeah, but I'll show you very, very specifically. The second sort of problems, of course, arise for the developer and of the system when you have to combine all that with a series of interfaces, both hardware and software. This is our setup. Yeah, this is our setup for an experiment we did with Stella Paschalidou, my collaborator in Thessaloniki. It was a very guerrilla-like experiment because it was the two of us and we had to deal with all of this installation in a very short amount of time with very little computing power. So, you know, there are constraints like that. Just and then there are some more general affordances and constraints. Every time I use the word affordance, I'm making a reference to James J. Gibson's ecological psychology. So affordances are the possibilities for action in a certain environment according to our skill set. And yeah, the problem derives first from the fact that we have multiple modalities when we are performing, like movement, touch, sound, image, and different data streams that we need to basically synchronize and align in time. That's very, very important. And it's this heterogeneity creates very, very specific technical problems. One of them being also the fact that we have to derive higher order structure from this raw data or even processed data, like filtered data. And this is a question which goes back to the pyramid I showed before, the data, information, knowledge, wisdom pyramid. How can we go from these 9 axes of acceleration data to something that tells us anything, you know? That's a big epistemological question.
I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of Weinberger's work, right?
Yeah.
The tools by which you gather information.
And of course, it's not only capturing fingers. Today we are working for this current project with facial expressions, where face recognition, we turn, I'll show, I cannot show many examples from that because it's still a work in progress, but we're turning my face expressions into some sort of correlation with the algebraic groups in Xenakis Herma, which is quite weird because you have the very abstract math and then you have my face turning into different colors and shapes. Of course, the issue of invasiveness for the performer we already talked about. Markers and calibration follow us all around the process in order to be able to use those data. There are issues of using the systems online, that is in real time. For example, we had nightmares trying to use the perception neuron system through Wi-Fi, whereas just connecting it through a cable was found to be the solution, but of course connecting it through a cable creates all sorts of logistical problems before and after performance, things like that.
When you're doing these projects, do you have to worry about, and he's going to have to deal with this very soon, with the issue of ethics? Are you having to deal with any of those kind of controls?
Normally I'm the subject, so
okay.
I don't...
Okay. If you do it on yourself, it's okay.
Yeah, even though it isn't so often. I mean, I also do have problems with the ways other people, like the collaborators, would be able to use my data in a certain moment, because those are intimate data about how I move, for example, and you know they are shared with other people. So it's not so straightforward, but there are definitely ethical issues when you have studies with subjects, like real experimental studies, and they are.
And do you have to pass through certain committees in order to do any of this?
Absolutely, yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. That's it goes without saying that you need consent in the first place, and then you need to stick to certain ethical standards when it comes to you need to see even the ways you're using the sensors on the body of the performer, because those systems are not always sometimes they're custom made, they are not
And have you had to go through human subjects review committees?
not really, not yet.
Not yet, okay.
But that's yes, that's something that really I find appropriate to do, because we're dealing with, no matter how okay it might not be stem cell research, but we still deal with human data. And the last issue, of course, when dealing with Xenakis is that Xenakis is already extreme, and you put a layer of extremity on top of everything else, and some of the systems cannot work just because of how rapid or how forceful it is. So to give you an example from the computational musicology applications, this is again on mists by Iannis Xenakis, who has described the piece basically as three different types of materials, whether those sieves, as we know them, hyperscales, based on a certain arrangement of the intervals, or what he calls Brownian movements in space. So he takes the material of the scale and he explodes it, and he starts dealing with that through probabilistic functions, or what he calls arborescences, so geometrical constructions and tangles of lines in space. And what we've done here is that I have associated, this is an I because that's my work, but of course it's also the collaboration with Frédéric Bevilacqua in using the systems. So here you can see the linear situation in the original, where it is with a pink filter. It's a very, very good example of scales of the sieves. Then I have retranscribed that with the sort of low-tech representation as this continuous arm movement in 10 discrete sort of hand grasps. So how this is chunked according to my way of playing it, and this is another chunking according to fingering with a higher resolution, let's say, chunking. And then this is what one derives from a system which essentially has registered audio, has registered signals, has registered MIDI. I can show you the system a bit more closely. So you can see here the basic panel, or maybe I play also before that. I play the recording. So this is a typical max patch we use for synchronizing several data. And in this instance, we have audio. We have 6 signals from each hand. So 6 from the left hand and 6 from the right hand. These 6 signals are linear accelerations in 3 axes and rotations, like that. So basically each movement has a signature of 6 numbers. Then we have the MIDI, color coded with all the values for speed, for velocity. These are the pedals here, the 2 pedals. And these clusters here, actually, let me just make it a bit up.
So 100 on the pedal is full depression.
Yeah. And these here clusters are from sensors on the surfaces of the keys. It's a system developed by Andrew McPherson in Queen Mary University and in London. And basically you can have a blueprint of the shape of your hands on the keyboard. It's capacitive sensing, so you don't need essentially to touch, but it captures even, you know, in proximity. So you get this sort of immediate chunking of your hand grasps. And you can see here, it's very clear because these markers indicate displacement of the arm of the hand, and each time we have a displacement, we have a change in those chunkings, so to speak. Each time I have a displacement of my arm, there is a marker. How far what?
How far is considered displacement? It could be this much?
Displacement is essentially in relation to the hand grasp.
Right.
So it's not, you know, it's not defined by fingers, it's defined by the unit of the hand grasp.
Right.
Of the chord, of the implicit chord.
It could be this much?
Yeah, absolutely. It really depends on the data there.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is what I explained before. We can have a basic syntax of movement on the basis of this data. I'll talk about that a bit later as well. Just go back to the Xenakis. So the first type of material, the linear material, gives us a certain envelope for movement, which consists of preparation, bringing the hands on the keyboard, attacks, playing inside a certain position, displacement, which is the markers, and then release. And this is an envelope like the envelope for sound, attack ADSR, decay, sustain, release. It's exactly the same idea, how to create a basic envelope for any piano music on the keys. One could create also an envelope for playing inside, and it could be really very interesting. We haven't done it. The second type of music, the stochastic clouds, you see it's totally different. It's not linear anymore, it's non-linear. It's a very, very specific structure of grasps and arms, which are linear. And the PADR envelope is equally much more different and difficult. And so here you have in the PADR envelope different static and mobile sections. So you can process further the envelope in order to derive structures in this sort of thing. The third basic structure, arborescences, whereby we again find very static envelopes. So we might have music like that, but the overall result is two hand grasps. So you see how important it is in order to deal with this surface complexity. This surface complexity might have some underlying simplicity. And as I said, we have used these sort of techniques in order to model these stochastic clouds, for example here, in 6 different types of different density, directionality, different features and qualities of movement, in order to be able to grasp this very, very difficult section. And eventually one finds that, so I have color coded here different types of clouds, and one finds that basically the sort of impossible ones are the ones in pink. All the rest is totally feasible. And so this sort of knowledge can be used for teaching the piece. And this is the whole piece, by the way, the score you see there. And, you know, make something that usually is framed as impossible or not feasible at all, make it a much more accessible sort of thing.
So that's a really good interpretation, because my question was, it's such a rich data set that you're coming up with that that certain research